Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and today it's time to launch a new worm bin. I've got my labels here. I'm going to fill out a new label just like I've got for all my active worm bins. And it's going to be going on this container right down here. This bin on the shelf has been prepared and been resting here for a couple weeks now. And it's always best if you're setting up a new space for worms to give the environment a little bit of time to sort of settle in and become a nice, comfortable space for the worms before introducing the worms. There's this concept of an environment being sterile, and it's very true. The worms rely very heavily on the microbes and bacteria and fungus and all the little tiny microscopic life forms that live in their bin with them. The worms really rely on those little microorganisms to take any new food source and really start breaking it down, sort of pre-digesting it, pre-composting it, so that the worms can actually take it in as well. So any fresh, brand new environment, regardless of whether it's the favorite food that they eat or anything, everything requires a little bit of a jump start to make it compatible with the worm's digestive system. So that's the reason this bin has been sitting here and sort of priming for today, because today we're going to be introducing new worms. New red wiggler worms are going into my new worm bin. As of today, I'm going to have a fourth active worm bin with red wigglers. The two vermi bags out here, as well as an outdoor worm bin that I have night crawlers in them. And I've been trying for the past year or so, trying to expand beyond red wigglers. So these two populations of night crawlers are just being introduced into my wormery, and hopefully I'll have a good balance of different types of worms. But it's really up to you. It's whatever you've got available to you, whatever type your preference is. There's many different reasons why you might just go with one type of a worm or another. Maybe where you live, there's only a certain type available. The important thing is that the worms you buy or obtain should be specifically composting worms, because not all worms are composting worms. A lot of earthworms that you just find out in your garden, they tend to burrow really deep. They don't really work the surface. That's the main distinction between what's considered a composting worm and maybe not a composting worm, is one that really has a tendency to consume a lot of freshly rotting or freshly decomposing material, and also producing terrific manure, basically vermicompost, vermicompost recastings, another word for it. And that's really what you're after if you're gardening. That's your black gold in these bins that you're hoping for when it comes time to plant your new plants. So I'm going to write today's date right here onto this little label. So now, first things first, before we can launch worms into a new worm bin, we need to obtain the worms. And in my case, I'm fortunate enough to have fairly dense populations of worms in these two red wiggler bins. So I'm going to be enlisting volunteers from these two bins in order to populate my new bin. So before we get to the new bin, let's get these out on the table and get ready to pull some worms out of these bins. Okay, so this clear plastic container is what I'm going to use to hold the worms after we've enlisted them. And I have the first of the two bins here from which I'm going to get the volunteers. Let's see what we can do. This bin was fed, I believe it was 2 days ago, down here through the middle. Coffee filter was indicating where the feedings had occurred. So my hope is that I'm going to be able to find nice hunks of worms hanging out together where I can just grab them as a whole. The only problem is I did feed with a lot of sort of small chunk food most recently, so there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to end up scooping up a handful of food each time I try to grab worms. Let me think about this. Maybe if I go to the bottom, somewhere like right beneath the feeding zone, maybe I can avoid scooping up food and bedding and see if I can just grab a handful of worms. All right, let's just assume that we're going to get a fair amount of bedding and other material in each handful. So we're not going to let that slow us down. We'll just do our best to leave that behind when it comes time to launch these worms into their new space. Let's see how many we can get from under this side. We don't need to go too overboard because we have the other bin from which we can try to get worms too. So we'll do what we can. Try to get a few hundred together. Because one thing I had considered doing was actually weighing the number of worms that get loaded into the bin, just to see if I could make an estimate of the numbers. However, if I'm going to be mixing in this much additional material besides worms, see, this is all a bunch of cardboard bedding. I guess hopefully they'll squirm down and they'll leave some of this stuff on the surface and I could just pick it right off. So I'm going to let them be. Let them try to squirm away from the bright lights overhead. And they'll hopefully leave behind some stuff that we can skim off the top and separate them from the material that they're inhabiting. But speaking of the material that they're inhabiting, these castings are just so fine. Really beautiful material in this bin. And it is because I think I have large numbers of worms in my bins that I have such good action. I've seen different examples though. I've seen examples where people take an entire bin, maybe almost this size, maybe a little bit smaller, and they might launch it off with just a dozen worms, or maybe one mating pair, or some, really low numbers. And then they just let it go, and they let it go for a number of months and check in on it later to see how it's progressing. And it's interesting to see because in one example you can distinctly tell the parent worms, which are somewhat larger than the offsprings that they produced since they'd been in that bin. So you could see the two generations side by side when it's like that. So I think we've got a pretty good number of worms out of bin number 1 here. Why don't we cover this thing up again the way it was, and we'll go fetch the other bin and try to grab a number of worms from there too. Now this bin, I've commented on it in the past, I know, it's just such an obvious thing. When you lift it up, it's so much heavier than the other bin, which is right next to it, the one that we just finished working on. And they're, they're side by side, they're managed very similarly, so you expect them to be very similar in size, but this one is somewhat larger, it seems. The material in here is a little more damp, it looks like, than it was in the other bin. The other bin had material that really just crumbled away beautifully in your hands. This stuff's a little bit muddier. But since they are managed similarly, I'm assuming that we're going to have the best approach here as we had in the other bin, which is to sort of scoop under the feeding zone to see if we can get a good concentration of worms, and then hopefully extract them from the bottom, instead of having to deal with a whole bunch of food bits. Well, I guess that's not working well. I suppose in this case I must have gone right to the bottom with the food. So, let's restore that back down there. Let's see if there's another way to try to get a decent number of worms in one scoop. I don't know if there's a good way to do it. Maybe as I just sort of plow through, if I find a bunch, I just grab them right there. I almost feel like I'm doing this one by one. Usually I'm doing these in mass. But the nice thing is that with this pile that we're collecting over here, they will squirm down, and all the stuff on top can be easily skimmed off, and then we will in fact have just a mass of worms. So that'll be fun to see once we get to that point. I shouldn't be too surprised, but we'll do what we can to pick out as many as we could, large and small. I just don't want to bring a whole pile of food along for the ride. Okay, so I'm going to try to level this thing off, get it covered back up the way it was for the most part. We've really done a large disturbance to what's going on here, that's for sure. But no matter where you look within this bin, you can see there's just tons and tons of worms everywhere. They must really be enjoying this space that they're in. Alright, let's let these guys get back to work. Cover them up and put them back on the shelf. Thank you guys. Thank you for all the volunteers. Okay, here we have a close-up of our collected worms. And you can see a moment or two has passed since I readjusted the setup here, and you can see there's hardly any worms visible. Although if you listen carefully, you can definitely hear them squirming around inside the pile. So what they do is they just scoot down into the material, trying to get away from the bright lights. So I'm going to see if I can take advantage of that behavior and start scooping off some of these piles of material on the very top, which has been more or less depopulated at this time. Here again, the only reason I'm trying to do this is so that I can get a sense of sort of a percentage between the worms and the material that they're inhabiting here. It would be nice if I could somehow get to the point where I'm comfortable saying that, you know, 30% of it is worms or 50% of it is worms. And that might be about right, you know, if I consider how much material there's here as well as how many worms are in the material. Well, it's hard to say. Maybe the worms outnumber the material at this point, hopefully. So we'll just peel off a little bit here and there, off the sides, and then we'll just treat the remainder of it as mainly worms. I don't know, hard to say, maybe 75%? I'm not sure what the real proportion or ratio is, but it's mainly because I just want to get a sense of what the weight is and then, you know, based on, I think, 1,000 worms makes up a pound. I just want to get a sense of how many worms I'm starting with, which is something I've never done before, so I'm very curious to see what we end up with. Okay, here we have it. This container with the worms in it weighs 1 pound, 13.5 ounces. And what we can do afterwards, after the worms have been launched into their new worm bin, we can do another measurement to see what this container weighs without any worms in it. That'll tell us how many worms we launched off. Curious to see what it is. Okay, here we go. It's showtime. Here's the new bin, and we're going to launch the worms into it. Okay. So before, you saw this bin was covered with another plastic bin. And the whole idea behind that was to create sort of a terrarium effect. And if you take a close look here at the bin that was actually covering this, you can see water vapor and droplets of condensation collecting on it. And that's the whole idea, was to keep the moisture that had been placed into this bin, say 2 weeks ago when I built it, in the form of the food that's in there and the moisture that was added. Just allowing all that moisture to remain and work its way into the more dry materials that were placed on top. So this bin has a really nice, comfortable feel to it, and I think the worms can go right in there. Let's release them. It looks like we got them all. Perfect ejection. Oh, maybe one. Okay, we got them all. So there is material surrounding them, clearly, but they'll retreat down into the bed. They don't like these bright overhead lights, and they'll be out of view momentarily. So let's give them time to get comfortable. Well, it's been about 30 minutes now, and during that time I've actually cleaned out the clear plastic container that these worms were brought over here in, so we can weigh it. But before we do that, I'm just going to cover these guys up and let them get cozied into their new spot. This is their new home for the next, I don't know how many months. Hopefully they'll be comfortable, hopefully they'll mate, reproduce, and produce a whole bunch of really nice vermicompost for my garden. So these worms will burrow down, occupy the space. The material is nice and cool and damp, and I think they're going to enjoy it. But I will be checking in on them over the next week or two, at which time I'm not going to feed. I'm not going to give this bin any food because it was built with food in there. And the entire bedding is also all edible materials from their perspective. So I'm just going to let this sit for a couple weeks until such a time that I think it's ready for its first feeding. So I think the time has come to okay, there's the new date. Let's get this bin up onto the shelf. And there she goes. The last thing to be done, which is completely optional, but I'm just curious, and it's actually the first time that I'm doing it, is measuring how many worms we launched into the bin. So you remember we weighed this with the worms in it, and now we're weighing it without, and it's a 9-ounce container. And we had 1 pound 13 ounces. So, you know, we're talking well over 1,000 worms here. I've hung up my gloves and I've washed all the containers that we used today, and now I've got myself one more worm bin. So we'll be tracking its progress and seeing how it comes along, but the last thing I'll be needing to think about is their next feeding, which is probably going to be a week or two down the road. But in preparation for that, I'll be setting aside compostable kitchen scraps and other things that I think will be useful to keep them sustained. So, last thing to do is to go up to my spreadsheet, show the active day this bin started, start tracking it like the rest of my wormery. So let me finish just by thanking you for keeping me company. I always really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember, give it a thumbs up. That really counts. And it's also great if you sign up to become a subscriber to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.